welcome to Storyteller. Today we are going to listen to some really scary stories. Make sure to subscribe, and write down in the comments where are you listening this from. Let's start. Been reading a lot of stories on here lately and it made me start thinking about some of my own paranormal experiences. This story is 100% true, not a whole lot to it, but it is one of the most viscerally horrifying things that has ever happened to me. Back in 2016, I was in a long-term relationship with this girl whose family lived in a small town in Connecticut. We'd been dating for a little over a year and I'd met her parents a few times, but this was our first time actually driving down and staying at her childhood home. I was already a little nervous about crashing with her parents and making a good impression, but she assured me everything would be fine. The whole drive down was incredibly scenic and the town itself had all the usual trappings of a cute colonial town. We pulled up to the place and it's this beautiful 3-story old house half sitting on a hill overlooking a big green yard. Her parents greeted us and were super welcoming, leading us into an open foyer with a dark wooden staircase. The house was clearly very old, but in a nice cozy sort of way. It had clearly been remodeled from those old school New England homes with some slight modern touches. My ex said we'd be sleeping in the guest room upstairs because her childhood bedroom only had a skinny single bed. She made sure to qualify though that her house is sort of haunted and the guest room is where most of the ghost activity had centered around. I asked her to clarify what that meant and she said her brother had slept in the room a couple times and weird stuff had happened while he was in there. She didn't really elaborate any further, and in a way I could tell she was trying to downplay it or not freak me out. She did say though that pretty much everyone in her family had one strange experience or another while living in the house. When her dad was remodeling the kitchen, he was home alone working and sat down to take a break. While he was sitting in silence drinking some water, he suddenly felt a hand strong grip his right shoulder from behind. He jumped out his chair and looked around, but no one was there. He's a completely normal, non-superstitious guy, and when I asked him about it, he said he thought a spirit was trying to warn him not to make changes to the house. Another time my ex was home alone with her dog watching TV downstairs, and all of a sudden she heard loud banging footsteps walking down the hall upstairs. As the footsteps continued down the hall, she could swear she heard someone banging on the walls, slowly approaching the top of the staircase. Her dog ran to the bottom of the stairs and started barking like crazy. She grabbed her phone, grabbed the dog, seeing nothing at the top of the stairs, and ran outside. She called her parents and called the police while watching the house from the sidewalk a little ways away. From where she was situated, she could see both entrances to the house, and the way the windows are set up, you couldn't jump out a second-story window without breaking your legs. The police searched the place and found no one, and her family chalked it up to a ghost. There has also been some smaller spooky stuff that has happened, like their attic door closing on its own. Even if they put a chair in front of the door when they go up to get something, they'll come back down the stairs to find the door closed. For some reason that irked me the most, and I refused to go up there. Anyway, the actual experience I had was my first night staying there. We were settling down to go to bed in the guest room, and I remember being slightly bothered by the lighting in the room. It just felt off or slightly uncanny. It was both very bright and dim at the same time. I figured I was just tired, and we climbed into bed and slowly nodded off to sleep. Now I don't know if I was dreaming before this happened, but in the middle of me being asleep, a woman appeared in my dreams. She was violently angry and started addressing me directly. She showed me people in my life that I loved, my ex, family, friends, and she started putting broken glass into their gums, scraping against their teeth. I was just frozen in the dream. I couldn't even react. She told me that she was going to torture and kill everyone I cared about. She promised me that everything she was saying was very real. I tried to wake up and was mentally struggling against whatever grip she had on me, and for a second I did wake up. I was in bed sitting in the darkness, and then somehow the woman transmuted from the previous dream to this new one and screamed, "You will never escape." I woke up, for real this time, bolting upright, screaming and violently shaking. This woke my girlfriend up and she immediately tried to calm me down, asking what was wrong. I started crying, trying to recount to her what had just happened and how viscerally real and fucked up it was. She reassured me that it was just a dream, and I slowly started to calm down a little. I was genuinely afraid to go back to sleep, but we ended up somehow being able to nod back off, and I made it to morning without any other incident. We stayed at the house in that room a couple more times over the years after that, and I never had a dream like that again. You could probably chalk it up to the power of suggestion, being in a new place, being told that the guest room had ghost activity, but that is the only time before or since that I've ever had a true night terror or woken up screaming. I have never had a dream that even approaches the level of intensity to that one. I honestly don't know what to make of it. It's probably just my brain freaking out, but as a first-timer in that house it felt like a warning. The call rang in at 7:42. I had just begun that day's closing operations, silently thanking God for another day of lackluster work. It's not every day that there's a missing child or a murdered spouse, and to be quite frank, I like to keep it that way. Most days, like today, were calls of wrong numbers or the occasional missing dog. Today, Paul Jordan's boy, Kieran, called to tell us his cat ran from home. When we arrived, a very apologetic Paul and tearful Kieran informed us the cat had simply passed away the night before. As such, on a day like today, you don't expect the phone to change your life. I placed the cell to my ear, and was greeted by an unfamiliar voice. "Hello," it stated, barely audible. "Sheriff's office, what can I do for you?" I responded, placing a cigarette into my mouth. "Oh, I called the right number." The woman on the other end sounded 20 at the oldest. Her breath shook heavily, as though she had just run a mile and a half in the dead of winter. I could hardly make out her words behind the heavy pattering of rain. She sounded quite surprised to get a hold of me, and I was quite surprised I didn't know who she was. Lawrence had a population of 1,200, and I'd spoken to just about all of them. "I suppose you did. What kind of work do you folks do?" I paused, trying to remember if I truly had answered the phone the way I did. I suppose she took my silence as a confirmation of what she suspected, as she continued. "I'm the new caretaker for Mr. and Mrs. Mulligan. You know, Tom and Esther." Right, sorry. Mrs. Mulligan is in some sort of bad way, and we need her examined." I glanced at the clock. 7:45. "Ma'am, I think you should call a doctor, then." "Loran is I've already called Dr. Willows," she cut me off. "She won't go back." This statement gave me pause. Dr. Loran Willows was a great friend of the Mulligans, being that she was the only medical doctor in town. She likely knew more folks than I did. I knew that if Esther was in bad sorts, she'd want to help in any way possible. "Right," I said finally. "What's happening?" "I'm not sure how to describe it. Mrs. Mulligan, she won't die." I paused again, unsure if I had heard her correctly. I had thought, perhaps, but this young woman had signed up to be a caretaker for one, not two. Maybe she didn't want to care for Esther, and had slipped in her words. "Well, that's wonderful." I chuckled slightly. "I assure you it's not, sir. Please, you need to come as quickly as you can." The phone call was disconnected before I could respond. I figured, with hesitation, that even if I didn't go on the business of the call, a wellness check was clearly in order. I called over my partner, John Lewis, and told him to put on his coat. "Where are we off to?" "My shift is over in 10. John whined. "Mine too," I sighed. "We're going to the Mulligans." "Why's that?" he questioned, seeming less concerned with his punch cards. "Wellness check," I said, opening the front door of the sheriff's office. "Their new caretaker is. John probed. "She's, worried about Esther." I decided not to mention the fact that this new maid, whatever her name was, seemed suspiciously infatuated with the death of an old woman. John had grown up in this town, unlike me, and was surely even more concerned about the Mulligans than I was. As we arrived at the old home, it was in a horrible state of disrepair. The driveway was cracked and laden with all sorts of odd materials. Fire axes, a disconnected garden hose, an open bear trap, and more lay haphazardly around the front yard. One of the downstairs windows was busted, covered by a blue tarp from the outside. The walkway to the front steps had been flooded by the heavy downpour that was still raging violently, and we couldn't see any lights on in the house. Whoever this caretaker was, she wasn't very good at her job. "Christ!" John bellowed, taking me out of my trance. "Put it down, Thomas." I swung my head in the direction he was yelling. Outside, in the pouring rain, stood Thomas Mulligan. He was sitting half upright against a tree with a shotgun in his hands, pointed directly at John and I, Mr. Mulligan. I, too, shouted. We're here to check on Esther. We don't want your help, creeper. He yelled, pointed the shotgun dead at me. Or you either, fatso. I glanced over at John, who seemed both upset that he wasn't recognized and that his childhood neighbor just insulted him. I placed my hands out and motioned for Thomas to put down the shotgun that was now pointed back at John. Mr. Mulligan, I'm Officer Grayson, I said slowly and firmly. And this is Officer Lewis. You know me, Thomas. It's me, John. My partner interjected, his voice quaking. At that, Mr. Mulligan lowered his shotgun, and the three of us let out a simultaneous sigh of relief. We approached the tree Mr. Mulligan was leaning against, and he raised his shotgun once more. No, please, Mr. Mulligan yelled, more fearful than agitated now. You don't want to. You, Mr. Mulligan's voice was cut off by the sound of the front door to the house swinging open with a loud crash. The silhouette of a frail young woman stepped onto the front porch. Are you the officers I called? The woman shouted as loud as she could, but was still hardly audible. Yes, ma'am, I replied. Are you aware that Thomas is out here in the rain with a loaded weapon? I haven't been able to get him to come back inside. She replied, approaching us weakly. I noticed she had a slight limp in her walk, and her right arm hung limply at her side. She was impossibly thin, with dinner plate-sized eyes and straight brown hair. Well, miss, John stated, passing glances between her and Mr. Mulligan. Olivia Newman, she said quietly. Miss Newman, I'm not going to tell you how to do your job, but Thomas is your responsibility. We need to get him inside. Oh, don't blame her, Jack, Mr. Mulligan said hoarsely. I might be old, but I can still make my own decisions. I chose to come out here, and out here is where I'm staying. I kneeled down to meet Mr. Mulligan at eye level. He was bleeding, but I couldn't tell where over the rain. He was equally as emaciated as Miss Newman, like the pair hadn't eaten in weeks. His clothes were ill-fitted and torn, and he had a 1,000-yard stare like I'd never seen on another human being before. What happened here, Mr. Mulligan? I asked softly, his eyes drifted subtly away from mine as he began to speak. Olivia didn't tell you? It's... Oh, God. She won't die, kid. Who won't die, Thomas? Mr. Mulligan looked me dead in my eyes. He smiled, and spoke uncharacteristically calmly. Son, promise me something, he whimpered, gazing back at the house. If you send her to hell, tell her I said I was sorry the Lord couldn't take her where I'm going. With that, Thomas Mulligan, aged 85, went completely limp. His eyes had an unchanged soullessness, as though he died long ago. His smile faded, and the shotgun fell onto the driveway with a loud clatter. I stood up solemnly. Miss Newman began to scream, and John had the same exact stare Mr. Mulligan had just given me. I'm real sorry, John, I said, placing a hand on his shoulder. You've seen enough for tonight. Go home and hug your dad, man. John shrugged my hand off his shoulder. Someone has to call in the body, he said. I didn't argue with him, as I still had to tend to Miss Newman and locate Mrs. Mulligan. I hung my head, sighed, and turned to Miss Newman. She was gently shaking Mr. Mulligan's body and sobbing uncontrollably. I placed my hand on her shoulder and gave her the warmest look I could muster at that moment. Olivia, I said, we should probably go check on Esther. Olivia said nothing. She turned back to Mr. Mulligan's body and did not move. I stood with her a moment, then headed toward the front door. I still had a job to do. The inside of the house was even more disgusting than the outside. Piles of dirted clothes, spilled pill bottles, and rotting food covered the living room. The main stairs were missing half of the steps, and the banister was splintered in several directions. I held my breath as I carefully ascended the stairs, fearing more with each step that I would fall through them entirely. The upstairs was equally as unpleasant. Peeling wallpaper and black mold all over the walls. The carpet was stained and matted, and a dog food bowl labeled Pommy was overflowing with canned meat. At the far end of the hall laid a single, strangely pristine bedroom door. A sense of dread hit me instantly as I approached the door. I suddenly became quite aware that I was alone, but there was nobody else on the way. I knew I was about to see either an emaciated old woman who I knew personally, or a dead body. I knew that there was by way anyone would hear me scream over the rain and thunder outside. I knew that if Olivia made her way back inside, she would find me too. I knew John would have to go looking for me if I didn't come back. "Mrs. Mulligan?" I shouted. Nobody answered. "Esther? This is Officer Sam Grayson. I'm with the police. Is everything all right?" There was still no response. "Esther, I'm gonna come in, okay?" I twisted the doorknob hesitantly and pushed it open. As soon as I did, a small Yorkshire Terrier bolted out of the room. I watched him run down the stairs and out of the house, like he hadn't left that room his whole life. He was well groomed, fit, and generally looked more cared for than either of the human residents I had met. Inside the room, there was a single wooden chair on its side directly in the middle. An empty noose hung from the ceiling. As I shone my flashlight on the room, I realized it was completely tidy. There was no indication it had been connected to the rest of the house as it lay empty. There was a small vase with healthy flowers in it, the bed was made intact, and the television was softly broadcasting the news. "Oh my, hello officer." I swung around as quickly as I could. Behind me, in the doorway, stood Esther Mulligan. She was as I remembered her, short, well-fed, and with a sweet glow about her. She gave me a comforting smile and walked past me with a large basket of dirty, mildewy clothes. "I heard about my dear Thomas," she said, almost giggling. "Shame he didn't come back in the house." She began folding the clothes and did not look at me. She either didn't notice or didn't care, but the clothes were completely unsalvageable. "You did, though, didn't you?" She smiled, gesturing for me to sit next to her on the edge of the bed. I approached slowly, picking up the turned-over chair in the middle of the room. "Oh, that was a fun one," she said cheerfully, pointing at the noose. "Tried to hang myself. Doesn't feel nearly as uncomfortable as you'd think, with the right kind of rope, naturally." I cautiously sat down beside her, and opened my mouth to speak. Nothing came out. "You know," she said, "I heard little Jack was an officer now. Is he downstairs?" No ma'am." I managed to squeak out. Well, beggars can't be choosers, can they?" She placed a wrinkly, shaking hand on my thigh. "Olivia wasn't my first choice either, mind you, we've gone through a lot of caretakers these past few months. You, though," Esther looked me up and down, and pointed toward my gun holster. "I won't say we haven't tried it," she remarked, "but would you humor me?" I placed my hand on my gun, having every intention of it staying holstered. I shook my head slowly, unsure if words would come out if I tried. Well," Esther said sadly, "I'd say you were free to leave, but Thomas and Olivia didn't fare so well, did they?" She stood up slowly and motioned for me to follow her. Against my better judgment, I kept a reasonable distance and followed her. She led me carefully around piles of food, trash, and laundry until we landed at the front door. "Quickly now, before it closes again," she remarked, stepping outside of the house. As soon as I joined her back onto the front porch, the door slammed closed on its own. Outside lay the bodies of Thomas Mulligan, Olivia Newman, and that little dog. The dog was now as unkempt and skinny as the other two corpses, like it had rotted away as soon as it crossed the threshold of the front door. John was noticeably absent. The car was still there, but had nobody inside of it. "Little time to waste," Esther said, stepping over the little Yorkie. She stood in the middle of the driveway and held her arms out to her sides. "Try to see if you can do what they couldn't, Officer Grayson." I had no idea what she meant by that. My focus was clear on the bodies outside. When did Olivia pass? How did the dog die? What the hell was going on? Where the hell was John? I'm not sure how to describe what happened next. One moment I was focused solely on the bodies of the deceased, and the next, I had my gun in my hands and a bullet in the old woman. It was as if she had completely removed my free will, like she wanted her ending to go exactly as she planned, and didn't want me mulling it over too long. Esther laid on the grass, emaciated and unwashed, with a bullet in her head. Just as I had started to approach her, I felt a sharp pain in my left shoulder. I grabbed my shoulder and fell to the ground. As soon as I hit the floor, the rain had stopped. I was bleeding heavily, and John was standing over me. The bodies of the Mulligans laid across the yard. Fully healthy, fully washed, fully lifelike. John was screaming at me, but I couldn't figure out what he was trying to tell me. Something about whether I had gone insane, what the hell I was thinking, why the hell I would harm that old woman. I tried to tell him she wanted me to, but I had no choice, but he wouldn't listen to me. Just as he was getting ready to put me into custody, the house began to shake. The entire building creaked and whined for 30 seconds. Then, as quickly as it started, it stopped. The building was back to normal, as though nobody had ever been inside of it. One by one, the Mulligans began to sit up, brush off their clothes, and head back inside. "Thanks for trying, officers," Olivia said sadly. "We'll probably see you again in a few weeks. Mrs. Mulligan can't help it." And with that, she closed the front door and locked it. John quit the force about a week after that call. They never did call again, at least not that I was ever made aware of. As far as I knew, life went back to normal for everyone but John and I. We agreed it would be best to not mention to anyone what happened. We didn't want anyone to go through what we had. I had all but completely repressed this memory over the last few years, but last week I was called back to the house. The entire building had burst into flames, with all 3 of its inhabitants presumed dead. I didn't register that it was the same house where it all happened until, when looking for the deceased, I found a partially melted dog bowl labeled Pommy. No bodies were ever recovered from that house. It sits empty now, ready to be demolished. There was no family that ever claimed the property, and nobody ever reported anyone named Olivia Newman living in the home at all. As far as anyone can recall, the Mulligans lived alone, without the need for a caretaker. Even John is starting to forget the details of that night, and I'm afraid I will too. I'm writing this down in case anyone has any information on Olivia Newman or the fire in Lawrence, Washington. If you know anything, please contact me. I might not remember this story soon, so please be as timely as possible. My dad was, and still is, my hero. I'm sure it sounds like just another worn-out cliché, and, hell, it might be, but it is very important to me that you remember this piece of information because, otherwise, all the things that I am going to tell you about, all the actions I've taken, will make me seem like a total lunatic. He was an anthropologist by trade, and you could tell from the moment you met him. Even as young as I was, I knew that my dad loved people. He was fascinated by them, and he adored everything about them. It was woven into the dorky Hawaiian dad shirts he wore when he threw spontaneous backyard barbecues, tucked into his palm as he enthusiastically shook hands with every barista and bank teller he met, and etched into the crinkles of his eyes as he let out another boisterous laugh, the sort of laugh that made everyone else in the area want to laugh with him. People, it seems, loved him too. He wrote a lot of books, and apparently his personality shone even in writing because they sold incredibly well. It was after the smashing success of one book in particular, one discussing folk legends in our home state of Colorado, that he decided we would buy the vacation home. God, it seems bitterly ironic looking back on it now. But we'll get to that. The vacation home was in a tiny Welsh town called Arforder. It was, as the Welsh name suggests, on the sea, and the town lined a semicircular divot in the country's coastline, flanked on either side by craggy cliffs. Only a short distance out from the beach, approximately where the center of the circle would be if it were completed, there was a tiny island. It was scarcely more than a large rock, harboring little besides a couple of small grottos and a smattering of gulls' nests. It was called Morgan's Isle. I only ever got to spend a couple of summers at the house, but I remember those summers very fondly. My dad was deeply interested in the area, not only because of his appreciation for Welsh culture, or what little remained after the gentrification of the area, but also because of some of the town's more unique attractions. 2 in particular stand out to me as I reflect on it, and both involve the island. If you were outside at night, or when a dense fog had blanketed the town, you could hear a low, haunting melody rolling in off the sea. It was like someone playing the flute, resonant and mournful, far away across the water. My dad thought that it was the wind, catching in the cracks and crevices of Morgan's Isle and flowing back out across the water, friction from the sea soaked rocks producing the ghostly howl. During the day, he said, the sounds of the town drowned it out. But at night, we would sit together on the back porch of the house, and listen to the island sing across the inky sea. From our porch, it was also possible to observe the other phenomenon. If you looked out towards the island on a clear night, it was possible to see small, glittering points of light drifting over the dark water. They typically appeared in pairs, and they seemed to dip and swell as if riding atop the waves. My dad thought that it was a trick of the moonlight, perhaps an unusual reflection from something on the island or the shore. And he thought they were beautiful. Like diamonds drifting on the sea, he said. And I looked up at him, stars in my eyes, and agreed. I was only 9 when he disappeared. He had decided that he was going to go out fishing for the day. We had a small boat, and he went out on it pretty frequently, leaving in the mid-morning and not returning until the last dregs of sunlight were slipping from the sky. Usually, he would let me come with, and I begged to go that day too, but he wouldn't let me. I'm still not sure why. Maybe I had been particularly clingy for the days preceding, or maybe he was planning to go out and do something dangerous that morning, I don't know. But I do know that, as darkness fell that evening, he didn't come back. And he never did again. They found the boat, bashed up against the cliffs a few miles down the coast from our forter, but no sign of Dad. While accidents like this were uncommon in the area, they were not unheard of, and it was ultimately written off as an accidental drowning. They trolled the area for a while, looking for his body, but nothing turned up, and, after the worst plane ride of our lives, my mom and I had to bury an empty casket. We didn't go back to the vacation home after that. We were alright financially, as my dad had left us a sizable chunk of savings to supplement my mom's income, but we couldn't face going back to where it had all happened. At the same time, though, my mom couldn't bear to get rid of the place. And so it sat, falling into disrepair, for 11 years. Until a few days ago. I recently turned 20 and, after having something of an early life crisis, decided it was time to get some closure. My mom was not a big fan of my decision. If it was up to her, we would just let the house rot to nothing and never think about it again. But I had made up my mind, and, before she could mount any real effort to stop me, I was bound for Cardiff Airport. I opted to check into our forter's small inns rather than attempting to stay in the house. This turned out to be a smart decision, as, when I arrived at our old vacation home, it was in a state of severe disrepair. Being so close to the sea, weathering had taken its toll on the home's exterior, and the once well-kept garden had turned into a tangle of unkempt grass and thorny weeds. The interior was largely preserved, save for one room which had flooded through a hole in the roof, but a thick layer of dust had settled over what little furnishings had remained when we'd vacated the place. Evening was fast approaching, and I decided that it would be best if I returned to the inn to decide what to do with the place. As I was pushing through the door, I turned back one last time, half expecting to see my dad sitting on the stairs behind me. But no one was there. After a restless night, I decided to spend the next day, yesterday, out on the water. I bought some supplies from a dingy little tackle shop and slid into a rented boat in the harbor. As I chugged out into the sea, I had this eerie feeling that I was reliving my dad's last day. Peering across the glittering waves, my eyes snagged on a narrow cave tucked into the jagged flank of Morgan's Isle. I started steering towards it for a moment, but stopped myself. What was I doing? I'd seen people try to approach the cave before, and a patrol boat would always stop you, saying that it wasn't safe for public access. Liable to collapse, they'd say. A tiny part of my brain whispered that they probably hadn't checked there, all those years ago. They would have thought that it was too dangerous, not worth the risk of searching. Maybe, just maybe. No. I shook my head as if to knock the idiotic thoughts out of my brain. I was there to get closure, not to open some silly, dangerous, and likely fruitless investigation. I found myself a good spot a little ways past the island instead, and settled in for a day of fishing. I didn't end up catching anything. We had never caught much when I was younger anyway, and the years between had taken their toll on the already dwindling fish population. Besides, I could never quite completely wipe the thoughts of the cave from my mind. Before I knew it, the long, uneasy afternoon had slipped away into evening, and darkness spread quickly across the sky like a stain. As I rounded the island, I could see no other silhouettes against the shimmering lights of the town. I was alone on the water. And I was so close to the cave. I dragged my palms down my face. I knew I wouldn't get a wink of sleep if I didn't at least check, and, besides, now was the perfect opportunity, with no patrol boats crawling around. Hidden by the darkness of the open sea, I anchored the boat as close as I could to the tiny, rocky beach at the cave's mouth and splashed my way to the entrance, wincing as the icy water soaked into my sneakers. Standing on the gravel beach, I fumbled in my pocket. I was relieved to feel the clink of my key ring against my fingertips. Pulling it out, I pressed the button on the small flashlight that I kept clipped to the ring, and its weak beam cut through the darkness ahead of me. The small comfort that the light afforded me was dashed as I heard scuffling from behind some large stones just a few feet ahead. My hand shook as I pointed the flashlight toward the source of the sound, and I stumbled back as a figure moved from behind the rocks. "Dad?" It had come out as a question, but as my disbelieving eyes flickered over the man in front of me, I was sure it was him. He was much older and far scruffier than he was when I'd last seen him, and he was still somewhat obscured by the shadows of the cave entrance. Still, I felt certain. It was my dad. My heart leapt in elation, and I stumbled forward, slipping on the loose, wet gravel in my haste to embrace him. To my dismay, however, he started backwards, jerking out of the way of my open arms and slipping backwards, further into the cave. "There's no time, Carter." His voice was rough and strangled with disuse. "What?" He jerked his head backwards, indicating for me to follow him into the cave. I was so stunned by the strangeness of the interaction, by his sudden appearance and by his form retreating further into the darkness of the cave, that I followed without question. At that moment, it seemed like the only thing I could do. While his stride seemed quick and practiced, mine were rendered unsteady by the slick rock beneath me. He was still just ahead of me, just on the edge of my flashlight beam, but I had to pick up my halted, slippery pace to keep up with him as he continued to press on. "There's no time for reunions yet. I promise you, all of that will come in due time, but for now I just need you to trust me." I was out of breath from our rapid pace, and, though questions burned at the tip of my tongue, I wasn't able to vocalize them. The walls of the cave seemed slightly closer now, and my claustrophobia built into a lump in my throat, further blocking any attempt at communication I might make. "Years ago, the day I disappeared, I discovered a ritual site in the back of this cave," he explained, as I staggered onward. "I don't remember what happened between then and 2 days ago. All I know is that I woke up here, with the ritual site glowing around me. I managed to find out the date from a passing boat. I don't know what happened, Carter, and I'm so sorry for leaving you for so long, but I do know that something is happening tonight, in this cave. I don't know what will happen if we don't stop it, but I don't want to find out. And I need your help." My head was spinning with all the new information. He was still moving quickly in front of me, and, stunned as I was, I lost my focus for a moment, and, with it, my footing. My toe caught a small ledge on the ground beneath me, and I tripped, halting for a moment as I caught myself on my hands, scraping myself badly. However, it was not the pain that I noticed. The moment I had stopped, so had my dad. I stood, slowly, and took another step forward. So did he. I took a few more, and he followed. But each time I stopped, he would too. It was as though he was determined to stay exactly as far from me as he was currently. Just close enough to still be visible, just far enough to avoid the full power of my feeble flashlight beam. My blood ran cold. "Carter, come on," he said gruffly, urgency, and something else that I know now to have been hunger, distorting his tone. "We have to hurry." That had been the point all along, hadn't it? To hurry me along, feed me lots of information all at once, give me no time to think. But now I was thinking. It was a plausible story, sure. My dad had been a curious man, and if he had seen the same opportunity one had, it was certainly possible that he would have tried to explore the cave as well. An anthropologist would have been intrigued by a perceived ritual site, and if something supernatural had indeed happened, it could explain his disappearance in the manner that he described. But something still bugged me. As I mentioned, my dad had always loved people. Now the first person he's seen in 11 years, even if those 11 years were a timeless blur, arrives at the cave and he spends no time greeting them? Not even when that person is his own son? It didn't seem right. I tensed my hand around my keychain and, in one smooth motion, moved forward and focused the pale beam right on the figure in front of me. He jolted backward as quickly as he could, but it wasn't fast enough. Not this time. And I finally saw him for what he was. Sure, he looked a lot like my dad. An aged up, banged up version of him, tailor-made to look as if he'd been unconscious in a cave for 11 years. An excellent copy. But I could also see why he'd been avoiding the light. In the detail afforded by the dim light, I could see the way his limbs seemed slightly too long, the way his shoulders didn't quite slot in their sockets, the way his teeth seemed just a bit too large for his mouth. And his eyes. Christ. They were the same color as my dad's, sure, but that is where the resemblance ended. They were empty, glassy, artificial. Like the false eyes they stick in taxidermied animals. A poor imitation of the real thing. My dad was an anthropologist, and I know a person when I see one. This wasn't. The next few minutes are a blur in my memory. I remember sprinting back in the direction I'd come, slipping and sliding on the algae-coated stone beneath me. I could hear him chasing me. And, worse, I could hear more of them behind him, scampering through the cave on what sounded to me like wet, slippery, clawed hands and feet. As I ran, I kicked rocks backwards, hoping they would slow the creature's progress. I guess it must have worked, because, the next thing I knew, I had flung myself into my boat and gunned it away from the island, not even bothering to look back and see how close an escape it had been. This brings me to today. As you might expect, I didn't sleep a wink. I spent the whole night researching, trying to figure out exactly what it was that happened to me. From what I've put together, it is likely that the first part of the story I was told was true. My dad probably did see the cave, seek the opportunity to explore it under the cover of darkness, and venture deep into it, hoping to discover a hidden anthropological treasure. But I don't think he found anything human in that horrible place, and I am certain now, even more than I was, that he is dead. Do you know where the name Morgan's comes from? I certainly didn't, before my midnight research session. I had always assumed that it was just named after an important figure in the area, like Jacksonville or Pennsylvania in the US. It turns out, though, that this is not the case. I doubt that many of the current residents of our fort would pick up on the name's significance. Hardly any of them are Welsh, and fewer still are old enough or rooted enough in the area to remember any of the legends attached to it. As it turns out, a Morgan or Morgan is a Welsh term for a creature that entices men into its lair, usually with its beauty or enchanting voice, in order to drown or consume them. In the US, we might refer to this creature as a siren. I believe that it is likely these creatures that I encountered in the cave last night, and if this is the case, there is no doubt in my mind that they are responsible for the disappearances of a number of visitors and locals alike over the years, including my poor father. As I am typing this, I am sitting on the back porch of the old vacation home. My flight leaves tomorrow morning, and I have one more night in the grubby little inn up the road, but something called me back here, telling me to look out over the dark and see one last time. I sincerely hope that it wasn't the sound that brought me here, that beautiful, achingly sorrowful timbre that echoes up the bluffs and draws me closer, sounding so much more melodic than it did all those years ago. Leaning in, I can see the flecks of light on the water again, tipping hypnotically up and down as waves roll by beneath them. I feel sick to my stomach. My dad was wrong. They aren't anything like diamonds. Looking at them now, I can see them for what they are. Fake. Dead. Empty. Like taxidermy. I live on the outer edge of a small, plains area farming town. Not many people, not many things to do, but it works great since the oil place I work for is close by. Tonight at about 9 p.m., I got a voicemail from the county reverse 911 that genuinely scared me. Not a tornado warning, or any kind of severe weather alert like it usually is. It was something else entirely. The automated message transcription my phone made said a message from county police. Go indoors and do not go outside. Close and lock all doors and windows. Shut all blinds. There is a threat to your safety. Call 911 if there is someone on your property that you do not know. Do not interact with anyone on your property that you do not know. If you are traveling, do not return home. This is not a test. There is a threat to your safety. This message made me instantly get that oh shit, sinking feeling in my stomach. Imagining for 10 seconds what could possibly be outside was scary enough that I did close and lock everything. About 30 minutes later, the power cut, and the only thing alive was the rapid beeping of the UPS system I hooked to my satellite modem and the green glow of the modem's power light. I whipped out the giant-ass flashlight my police officer friend Jim gave me, and went to reset the breaker. The breaker didn't pop. Everything was set exactly as it's supposed to be. That's when I realized it might not just be my house that no power. I had zero cell service, and the only remaining things with any power were my flashlight, the modem, the battery system, a small battery-powered lantern I found, and my laptop. Only things with batteries. I made the real bold, and stupid, decision to peek outside the blinds towards the rest of town to see if there was anything lit up out there. Why not? If I did it quick, should be an issue, right? I regret doing that. It was almost just light enough to see the outline of things around. When I took a look towards town, I first noticed that the area the town center is in, sorta like where all the businesses are lined up for non-small town people, was dead. The only light was coming from one building, as though a generator was keeping their porch lights alive for some reason. But then I noticed, off in the distance 200 or so feet away from my house, just barely visible, a person, or at least, something like a person. Someone just kinda standing out in the field looking toward the road. But as I tried to figure out who it was, I noticed that it started turning my way, followed by it walking my way as well. As soon as I noticed it moving, I jumped back from the blinds and ducked. I had to work up the guts to even move away and go back to the room I was keeping lit up. Since then, Eve heard knocking at the front and back door. But not like the regular knocking people do, where they knock a couple of times then give up and leave. This has been like someone smacking the door as hard as possible a few times every couple of minutes, then running back around to try the other. I genuinely do not know what's out there or what they want, but this has been going on for over 2 hours now. I've been hiding under my desk with an old rusted crowbar thing I took off the ground at work a few days ago, hoping whoever it is doesn't try to brute force their way in, and that if they do they'll be stupid enough to not check under the desk before I whack its knees. I'm hoping the router's battery system stays alive long enough for this to upload. I've been charging my phone with my laptop, and sending things through email and the web using the satellite modem. If I stop responding to this, it's likely because the modem finally died out. The county website isn't even online for me to check if there's been an all clear, and I have no service to call for help with. Hopefully one of the officers comes by patrolling and arrests whoever or whatever is outside my house. They'd be sending the cops out, right, given the message they sent? Or are they hiding too?